Good evening. Welcome to the March program of our Lewis L. Guy History Series. I'm Peggy McPhillips, President of Norfolk Historical Society, and I am pleased to bring back an old friend tonight. Chris Kolakowski is the former director of the MacArthur Memorial here in Norfolk, but he left us for Wisconsin not too long ago, where he is now the director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. And we've had a good time chatting before this program started, doing a little bit of catching up. He's going to tell you about a new book that he has coming out the end of this month after our program. Chris was born in Fredericksburg, Virginia, received BA in History and Mass Communications from Emory and Henry College, and a master's in Public History from the State University of New York at Albany. He has spent his whole career interpreting and preserving American military history. He's been with the National Park Service, the New York State government, the Rensselaer County Historical Society in New York, Kentucky State Parks, U.S. Army, and Norfolk's MacArthur Memorial. He's spoken to the Historical Society 2 or 3 times in the past, most recently about his book on Bataan. So he's like I said, he's an old friend. He's published 3 books on the Civil War, and his latest book will be released in late March, and he will tell you about that at the end of his program. So now please sit back and enjoy our program on the Korean War. Learn about how Korea came to be divided into 2 sections. What is it about the 38th parallel? What is the history of the peninsula? It was the first United Nations war, and it resulted in more deaths than many other wars, especially most of them being civilians. So Chris is going to give us an overview of the war, its context, and its relevance today. You all will notice at the bottom of your screen, there is a feature for chat or Q&A. If you will send in questions, I will keep track of them and we'll throw them all at Chris at the end of the program to answer. We are being recorded, so if you miss some of the program or you want to refer other people who have the bad luck to miss it tonight, we will be offering it on our YouTube channel probably within the next couple of days. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Chris Kolakowski. Chris, you're on.
Thank you, Peggy. It's great to be with you all again. It's great. I've seen some familiar faces in the audience. It's great to see everybody. And through the miracle of Zoom, being able to connect with Norfolk. Had a great 6 years as director of the MacArthur Memorial, and I've been up here. We got up here just before Christmas 2019, but still really appreciative of what the Historical Society does. Glad to hear of all the things that have been going on, even with the pandemic. And it's great to be here tonight to share perspectives on what is still a very relevant subject, the Korean War. Going to start the presentation here in a minute, but for those of you who may be wondering what the Veterans Museum is, we are the State Military Museum of the state of Wisconsin, and our mission is to preserve, interpret, and affirm the service of Wisconsin veterans from the Civil War right up to the present day. And we have an incredible collection. We're located right in the heart of downtown Madison, right across from the State Capitol building, as a matter of fact. If anybody's ever up here, I encourage you to stop by and check out what we have. We also do virtual programs much like this ourselves. And I encourage you to check out our website, which is wizvetsmuseum.com. And I just put that in the chat. So you're welcome to have a look at that and follow us on social media. But tonight we're going to spend our time talking about the Korean War, the war in Korea. And as Peggy said, why it happened, provide some context and this important story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and start my slideshow, assuming my mouse lets me. There we go. You should be able to see my slides and see my cursor moving around. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about the war in Korea. and what it means. This is the outline that we're going to do. We've got a lot to cover in the time that we have tonight. And so I figured the best thing to do is dive right in. And this is what we're going to cover. We're going to cover the strategic setting. Where is Korea? How do we go to war? The road to war specifically, what determines the timing of the war starting in 1950? Pusan and Inchon, the reverse in the north, kind of the conduct of the conflict, stabilization period as well. And then how the war goes into an armistice, and then make some concluding remarks about relevance. I will point out that this conflict, you saw me use the word armistice there. This conflict technically is still going on. We are technically at war with North Korea because the war ended in an armistice. It did not end in peace, and peace remains elusive on the Korean peninsula. And so that is something that as we think about it should be brought out. And actually, by that measure, this is the longest war the United States has ever been involved in since 1950. So you're talking 70, almost 72 years this June. So that's something I just want to put out there for people to think about. And so that's what we're going to spend our time covering tonight. And of course, in a group like this, I know I'm going to have some great questions. I look forward to the discussion afterwards as well. So first of all, let's set our stage. Let's set our scene. Where are we? We're in Northeast Asia. Let's look at where we are prior to the Korean War starting on the 25th of June, 1950. And let's start with a map. That's usually a good place to start to orient people into where we are in the world. This is Northeast Asia. Here's Russia to the north, which is north being at the top of the map. But here's Russia. This is a modern map, by the way. Mongolia, you can see China here. Northeast China, this is the area that I'm circling with my cursor that's known as Manchuria. Here's Beijing, where the 2022 Winter Olympics just concluded. Of course, you see Japan right over here. Hokkaido Island in the north, all the way down to Kyushu in the south. And Kita Kyushu, which is marked here on the map, is one of the sister cities of Norfolk, Virginia, as a matter of fact. Some of you may be aware of that, but I thought I'd mention that. And then between China and Japan is the Korean Peninsula, divided, as you can see, by North Korea and South Korea. The Republic of Korea is South Korea, no capital in Seoul. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, with the capital of Pyongyang. Korean Peninsula overall, from the southern tip of South Korea to the Yalu River, which is the border with China, is roughly 400 miles in length. At its narrowest point, it is about 220 miles in width. So 400 miles in length by about 220 in width. There are some variations, but those are kind of rough measurements to kind of think about. Here's the Yellow Sea. You can see immediately to the west, Sea of Japan here to the east. And then, of course, the East China Sea, Okinawa here to the south. And then directly south of Okinawa, just a few hundred miles, is Formosa, which today is Taiwan. It's been in the headlines, of course, as well. So this is still an area very much that is relevant as we will talk about. Just to give you an idea of where we are, Japan sits on the rough latitude of the continental United States. So that's something to keep in mind. And we'll talk a little bit more about the 38th parallel here in just a moment. But this is the geography. This is the area that we're going to be looking at here as we talk about the Korean War. Oh, and one other thing that should be pointed out is that you'll notice North Korea borders China almost exclusively. And I say almost because if you look real closely, immediately to the southwest of the Russian city of Vladivostok, there's 12 miles of Russian border that share a border with North Korea. And that's something that most people don't realize, but has geopolitical influence even to this day. And that's something that I recommend to your attention. But this is where we are. This is the general area of the world that we're focused on, in the Korean Peninsula, and you can see where it is here. Now, Korea had been ruled by Japan, occupied by Japan since 1910, from 1910 to 1945. In 1945, when the Japanese surrender, the United States and the Soviet Union administratively divide Korea at the 38th parallel. All troops north of the 38th parallel will surrender to the Soviet forces. All troops south of the 38th parallel will surrender to the Americans. This fairly quickly hardens into an international boundary, particularly because, as the Soviets were prone to do of any territory that they had moved into outside of the Soviet Union, they tended to create a Soviet puppet government, if you will, a communist government. And so while the US occupation is creating a government to the south, the Soviet occupation is creating a government to the north. And those ultimately become independent nations in 1948. On the 15th of August 1948, the Republic of Korea, which is recognized by the United Nations, South Korea, is founded. And then shortly thereafter, a few weeks later, on the 9th of September 1948, there's the proclamation announcing the formation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. Both countries claim the entire peninsula. There's a competing vision. I'll talk about the competing leaders here in just a moment, but you can see already this temporary division of Korea at the end of World War II has assumed a permanence that nobody expected just a few years before. And then in 1949, 1950, China falls to the communists. The Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists lose the mainland of China, which is a whole presentation in itself, fall back to Taiwan. The last nationalist troops leave in the spring of 1950. But in the 1st of October 1949, the People's Republic of China is proclaimed in Beijing by Mao Zedong. And then NATO, in the wake of the Berlin crisis and the Berlin airlift of 1948-49, is also taking shape in these months, basically between April and October of 1949. So there's a lot of change going on in the world, and there's a lot of change affecting Northeast Korea or Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula in particular. A lot of things changing in and around the peninsula in the 5 years after World War II. The two Korean leaders, the two visions, the man at the top, along with General MacArthur, in fact, at the ceremony proclaiming independence of the Republic of Korea, is Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee is 70 years old. He has worked his entire life for this moment to become the president of an independent, democratic Korea. And I say democratic, it's democratic up to a point. Rhee will do, and he's under tremendous pressure to not fall to the communists. He will do whatever he has to do to ensure that South Korea, the Republic of Korea, does not become a communist state, does not become a socialist state. So he's democratic, but he's democratic up to a point. His counterpart is the 32-year-old Kim Il-sung to the north in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And he has been installed by the Soviets, and with Soviet aid is creating a communist state. Now, Kim Il-sung is the grandson of the current leader of North Korea. His son, Kim Jong-il, takes over in 1994, and then his grandson, Kim Jong-un, of course, is the ruler today. But, and this is something that's important, Kim Il-sung is still the president of North Korea, which is pretty impressive when you think about it, since Kim Il-sung died in 1994. How is that? The North Korean Constitution proclaimed him the eternal president. As a matter of fact, his son was chairman of the State Defense Committee. That was his official title. He was not president. His grandson is chairman of the State Affairs Commission. So he's not president either. The official head of state is still Kim Il-sung, who's the eternal president. And if you've ever seen anything about North Korea, you know that portraits, statues of him are all over the place, along now with his son many times alongside as well. But that's something that needs to be borne in mind, is Kim Il-sung, even today, the major university in Pyongyang is Kim Il-sung University. He is really a guiding light for the North Korean people. And that's something that needs to be kind of be kept in mind, if you will. Syngman Rhee has a presidential library. He is still a hero in many parts of the Republic of Korea also. So you get these two Koreans, though, these two visions. Both of them claim the entire peninsula. And both of them also know that sooner or later, it's going to come to blows. And it is starting to come to blows even as 1949 passes along. Except for advisors, both the US and the Soviet Union pull out of the Korean Peninsula in early 1949 after the respective independence of the two Koreas. Both Rhee and Kim, as we've talked about, want one Korea under their leadership. Both of them are pushing clashes along the 38th parallel. There are various border skirmishes. Both of them are pushing guerrilla movements, particularly in the communists have great success with that, with some risings in the southwest of the Republic of Korea, southwestern part of South Korea. So it's a very kind of unsettled situation, and both men know that sooner or later the Koreas are going to go to war. So how do we go to war in June of 1950? How do we go from where we just were to the actual outbreak of hostilities on the 25th of June, 1950? Well, I'll explain that. First of all, we need to look at some signals that are sent from the United States regarding Korea in 1948 and 1949 and early 1950. This is what the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff has to say about Korea in 1948. Korea is of little strategic value to the United States, and any commitment to the United States' use of military force in Korea would be ill-advised and impracticable. A year later, General MacArthur, who is a military governor of Japan, overseeing the occupation of Japan. South Korea is in no danger of being overrun by North Korea. As long as South Korea is not a threat to North Korea, no action will be taken by the Kremlin to absorb it, as there would be nothing to gain by taking it over. These are two public statements by very prominent military leaders in the United States. And then add this, just a few months later, Dean Acheson of the National Press Club, who's the U.S. Secretary of State, to the National Press Club on January 12th, 1950. Our defensive perimeter, which is an interesting phrase in itself, runs along the Aleutians to Japan and then goes to the Ryukyus, which is where Okinawa is. From the Ryukyus to the Philippine Islands. So far as the military security of other areas in the Pacific is concerned, it must be clear that no person can guarantee these areas against military attack. But it must also be made clear that such a guarantee is hardly sensible or necessary within the realm of practical relationship. So if you remember that map I showed you earlier, the line that he's talking about runs in an arch from Japan, mainland Japan, down through Okinawa to the Philippines. It leaves out statement about two locations. Number one, Taiwan. Number two, the Korean Peninsula. And if you read into this, particularly if you read this in your newspapers in the Washington Embassy of the Soviet Union, it appears that the United States has no interest in the Korean Peninsula. And so what does this mean? A week later, the Soviet ambassador in Pyongyang reports to Joseph Stalin that Kim Il-sung thinks he needs to visit Stalin again in order to receive instructions and an authorization to launch an offensive. The communists have noticed, and they think there's an opportunity here to unify Korea as a communist nation. So Kim Il-sung starts to push what he calls the reunification plan. He needs to do this, though. He needs the backing of the Soviet Union and or China. He visits Moscow at the end of January 1950. Stalin says, fine, okay, but you must have the backing of China also. Mid-May, after the last of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists have left mainland China, Mao gives his final concurrence into the attack against South Korea. When I do this as professional development, I've done this as professional development with the NATO headquarters. When I was at the MacArthur Memorial, I used to talk about this as an example of how words matter and how statements can make a difference, sometimes intended in ways they never expected. And this is what has happened here. And so you can see in just 5 short months, we've gone from that statement by Dean Acheson to Kim Il-sung making the final preparations for an invasion of South Korea because he thinks it's there for the taking. So what happens? 25th of June, 1950, the North Koreans invade South Korea. Now, before we actually talk about how the war started, there's one other actor I want to put onto the stage here, or one other set of actors I want to put on the stage, and that is the U.S. forces in the Far East in June of 1950. There are advisors in South Korea. They're not actually under Douglas MacArthur, who's in Japan and commanding U.S. forces in the Far East. There are significant defense budget battles in Washington, as there's debates over priorities, Air Force versus Navy, the Army, with kind of the Army being stuck with what's left over. The budget battles not unlike some of the ones we've seen in the past decade in Washington. U.S. 8th Army governs Japan with 4 divisions on occupation duty. You can see there 7th, 24th, 25th, 1st Cavalry Division, and a few other scattered units as well. Most U.S. regiments, instead of the regulation 3 battalions, have only 2. That tells you how under strength these units are. And not only are they under strength, they turn over annually about 43% of their personnel. So there's no real continuity of training. There's no real continuity of organization. It doesn't matter what type of organization you are. If you turn over 43% of your people annually, your effectiveness is going to be reduced. You're just not going to have the training. You're not going to be able to coordinate. You're not going to have the trust in the organization and the continuity that builds a successful, solid organization to withstand crises. Certainly military organization, but other civilians as well. Little field training, by the way. They actually had a command post exercise in the winter of 1950, and they were so ill-equipped and underprepared that the headquarters nearly froze to death in the Japanese winter. So that tells you something about the readiness of these armies, of this army. And the equipment is mostly World War II vintage. There's a lot of vehicles that have been in storage since 1945. They'll find that actually something that's going on right now with some of the Russians in Ukraine is that they've brought equipment out from storage and took it into the field, and the tires dry rot, or the oil has congealed in the engines and there's issues. So the equipment is mostly World War II vintage, has not been taken very well care of, and is not reliable for immediate active service. And so that's something that needs to be borne in mind when we consider the performance of the U.S. Army in the first few weeks of the Korean War. As I mentioned, 25th of June, 1950, the invasion south of the 38th parallel. By the way, for those of you who are wondering the importance of the 38th parallel, Charlottesville sits on the latitude of Chosin, which I'm circling here with my cursor. And the 38th parallel runs just south of I-64 through Kentucky and through most of Virginia. And the 38th parallel runs right through Caroline County, halfway between Richmond and Fredericksburg. There's a marker actually in Caroline County that notes the 38th parallel. Norfolk's latitude would be approximately the latitude of Seoul, maybe give or take a little bit. So that gives you an idea of how the relevance of the 38th parallel and how Virginia is on the 38th and is split by the 38th parallel. And that's something that should be borne in mind. Again, here, North being at the top, here's southern part of North Korea. North Koreans invade South Korea, catches everybody by surprise on the morning of the 25th of June. And very quickly, the South Korean army is put into retreat. Seoul falls within a few days. Here's the capital of Seoul. And they begin to push south. And within the first 6 weeks, and I'll give you a little bit more detail on this here in a minute, but I want you to keep this map in mind. Within the first 6 weeks of the war, they occupy everything except this lower corner of Korea, which is the last 15% of the peninsula, and it becomes known as the Pusan Perimeter. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. But U.S. forces are brought across to engage the North Koreans and to get into this war. What does that look like? Well, first of all, the United States isn't doing anything until the United Nations tells it to. The United Nations, this is really the first United Nations war. The only UN recognized government on the peninsula is the South Korean government. So the UN Security Council, starting on the 27th of June and over the days following, passed several resolutions calling for peace, calling for all member nations to help South Korea, and asking the United States, particularly President Truman, Harry Truman in Washington, and of course Douglas MacArthur in Tokyo, to lead the United Nations effort. And so Douglas MacArthur will raise the UN flag over his headquarters in Tokyo alongside the United States flag. Now you may be wondering, where's the Soviet Union in all this with their veto on the UN Security Council? Keep in mind that China, the People's Republic of China, doesn't occupy their seat on the Security Council until the 1970s. Chiang Kai-shek holds the Chinese seat. The nationalists, the US allies, hold that seat until the early 70s. But the Soviet Union is boycotting the Security Council because Chiang Kai-shek is still sitting in China's seat. They will finally come back and take the rotating chairmanship until the 1st of August. But because the Soviet Union is boycotting, they are not there to veto these resolutions. And so the United Nations US and many coalition forces, in fact, it's a record number of nations that ultimately will support South Korea in some way, will get into this war, will get into this fight. And US troops, first from US 8th Army, particularly from the 24th Division and then several other divisions, will begin to come over to Korea. The first element of 406 men of the 19th Infantry, known as Task Force Smith. And when they get over there on July 4th and meet the first North Koreans, they expect that this will go, that the North Koreans will turn around and go back. Until the bazookas are found to be duds, some of the bazookas bounce, the anti-tank rounds bounce off of North Korean T-34s, and Task Force Smith is overrun with 50% casualties. And to this day, in the Pentagon, Task Force Smith is a byword for lack of preparation and sending American troops into battle unprepared and unready to meet an enemy on the attack. No more Task Force Smiths. The United States begins a global reinforcement effort for Korea, sending troops from the United States, sending troops from elsewhere, Army and Marine forces, to augment the forces there. Meanwhile, the rest of the US 8th Army begins to come across after that, try and stop the North Koreans, and ultimately will fall back to the Pusan Perimeter, where you'll get US, South Korean, and British. The first British contingent will arrive as well against the North Korean army. Two advantages that will basically pertain for the entire war is that the United States, the UN specifically, will have air supremacy over the Korean Peninsula. North Korean Air Force does do some things, but ultimately air superiority, air supremacy will belong to the UN pretty much the entire conflict. Same with the seas. The seas will effectively be owned by the UN during the conflict. Now, while the 8th Army is pulling back to the Pusan Perimeter, Douglas MacArthur begins to think about ways, offensive options, and ways to turn the tide. We'll look at those here in a moment. First, I want to talk about the fighting at Pusan, because this is an underappreciated battle, and in many ways, it's one of the great stands in the history of the United States Army, and is forgotten, should not be. Because without the successful stand at Pusan from the 1st of August until the 15th of September 1950, everything that follows would not happen. The mastermind behind that is the man here in the center, photographed during the battle, Walton Walker, who was one of George Patton's proteges during World War II. General Walker had been in command of the 8th Army since 1948. He's known as Bulldog. He's also known as Johnny Walker because he likes to drink that brand of scotch. But you can see why he's known as the Bulldog, because of the look on his face. Very determined, all over the front, everywhere he goes. It's a tremendous example. In fact, I was just teaching this yesterday as a case of personal leadership, outstanding personal leadership, making the difference for the team. It's not just him, though. It's a whole bunch of other leaders up and down the line that help hold the line. In fact, this man in the upper right, who later becomes chief of staff of the Korean Army, Paik Sun-yuk, General Paik, this is his line. He tells his division, which is in the northeastern or the northwestern part of the perimeter, if we run now, Korea is done for. And his leadership inspires many of the Koreans to hold on. This man to the left is Iron Mike Michaelis, and him and the 27th Infantry Wolfhound Regiment becomes the fire brigade. Wherever there's a threatened breakthrough, the 27th seems to show up, and Iron Mike Michaelis launches a counterattack that somehow restores the line. And then you get these three guys down here who all earned the Medal of Honor for leadership during the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter, including this man here, Sergeant Ernest Kuma, who's buried at Fort Knox. If you read his Medal of Honor citation and what he did, basically he and one tank holding off a North Korean regiment from crossing the last river before Pusan on the night of the 1st of September 1950. It's just incredible. And this is one of the incredible stands in the history of the United States Army. And it's because 8th Army hangs on that Douglas MacArthur is able to start thinking about offensive operations to turn the tide. And as he looks at the situation, he decides the best thing to do is let's envelop the North Koreans. Let's land at the port of Inchon, which is not far from Seoul, move across, take Seoul, recapture the capital, but more importantly, cut most of the lines of communication for the North Korean forces in South Korea. As early as July 2, just a week or so into the war, he's thinking about this, and he sells the concept on his superiors in Washington. The original concept used the 1st Cavalry Division. They had to go to Pusan. And then Operation Chromite used the 2nd Division, 5th Marine Regiment. They have to go to Pusan. Ultimately, on the 15th of September 1950, it'll be U.S. 10th Corps, along with the entire 1st Marine Division and 7th U.S. Division, 70,000 men attacking Inchon. Now, there are a lot of people in Washington that don't think that this will succeed. Douglas MacArthur uses a phrase, this is the first documented use of this phrase I've ever come across. I believe more in the Navy Marine Corps team than it believes in itself. And that's the first time I've ever heard that phrase, Navy Marine Corps team, which today is used widely in the military, certainly in the naval services. The big thing about Inchon, it's a narrow channel, and because of the tides, it's some of the highest tides in the world. It can only be landed once a month, really. So it's either the 15th of September. If they don't go on the 15th of September, it'll turn in. The invasion will have to be postponed a month till October 20th. And as one of the generals in the Joint Chiefs of Staff says, if you were to list all the reasons not to invade somewhere, quote, Inchon has them all. MacArthur's response, that's exactly why the North Koreans won't be expecting. And he's right. They will catch them by surprise. September 15th, 1950, 10th Corps, which I'm circling with my cursor, will land at Inchon. Next day, 16th September, 8th Corps will begin a breakout from the Pusan Perimeter, push north. 1st Cavalry Division, a couple weeks later, will meet here, fight, liberate Seoul. And by October 1st, back to the 38th parallel, have reversed all the losses since the war's beginning. It's one of MacArthur's greatest triumphs. Here's the Marines climbing the seawall at Inchon. Ladders, by the way, courtesy of the Tokyo Fire Department. That's how improvised this operation was. And of course, there's Douglas MacArthur and some of his senior leaders watching the landing as well. This is a great photograph. I love this photograph. Arguably, probably certainly one of the greatest, if not the last great triumph of Douglas MacArthur's career. By October 1st, gotten back to the 38th parallel. The question now becomes, as the UN forces are approaching the 38th parallel with what's left of the North Korean army in full flight, what do we do? Washington tells MacArthur, you are to feel unhampered strategically and tactically and go north of the 38th parallel. The UN backs them up by saying on the 7th of October, 1950, to reunify Korea if possible. And that's the word that's used, is use if possible. And so MacArthur, forward, let's go north. Let's push, let's drive for the border. Let's drive for the Yalu River and finish the victory. As that offense develops, Beijing, now it's important to understand, Mao's government at this point is an international pariah. It doesn't have formal relations with many nations. It has relations with the British, it has relations with the Indians, does not have direct relations with the United States, will not until 50 years ago last month when Nixon showed up and went to China in 1972. So there's no direct line of communication between Mao's government and the United States. So they said as this offensive develops and as the UN troops reach Pyongyang and it looks very much like they're driving for the Yalu River, Mao has the Indian ambassador gotten out of bed in the middle of the night and sends a message to the West via him, is that if substantial US forces reach the Yalu River or near the Yalu River, the Chinese will be forced to act. At the same time that this is going on, Truman flies out, meets MacArthur at Wake Island, where they discuss the war. And they really discuss what's going to happen after the war, because as far as Washington is concerned, as MacArthur is concerned as well, the war is pretty much over. What is the assessment of the Chinese coming into the war? MacArthur says, well, that you probably have better information. I regard it as minimal. And if you've seen the movie MacArthur, the scene of this discussion in that movie as depicted is a pretty close actual from some of the minutes that were surreptitiously taken from this meeting. But here's Truman and MacArthur. They meet, they discuss. At the end, both feel like it's a very positive meeting. Truman goes away from there feeling like the war is nearly over. And of course, MacArthur feels that way as well and launches a final drive to the Yalu in early November of 1950. And that's what this looks like. 8th Army advancing here to the west, with 10th Corps landing on the East Coast and beginning to move up in this direction along with the South Korean 1st Corps. moving up the northeastern part of the coast. Actually reached the Yalu in places. Ultimately, the high water mark will be this dashed line right here, where on the 27th of November, 300,000 Chinese announced their presence with great authority, and then begin what is known as the longest retreat in the history of the United States Army from this area in North Korea back down to the waist of Korea at the 38th parallel. This is a photograph from Chinese military history of some of the swarm attacks against U.S. troops through the winter. The snowy retreat from Chosin, 66 miles from the Chosin to the coast at Hungnam. It's one of the great retreats in American military history, as one of the Marines, Chesty Puller, who was involved, would later say. It's not retreat, it's attack in another direction. Another great quote from him in this battle is, "They've got us surrounded, we've got them right where we want them." So that's the kind of spirit that gets them through. It's one of the great retreats through some of the coldest weather that you could imagine that Americans have endured while fighting. Here's a map of the Chosin to Hungnam period. At one point, the Chinese blow a bridge right here at Funchalin Pass. They have to airdrop. They've never done it before. They airdrop pieces of a Bailey Bridge so that the column can rebuild and then move out. It's a tremendous story. It's probably a presentation in and of itself, but I encourage you to read more about it. It's a tremendous, and then the Americans get out relatively intact. And they managed to do some significant damage to the Chinese armies. The Chinese, by the way, People's Republic of China recently sponsored a movie about this from the Chinese perspective that has become something of a hit in China. So that's something to keep in mind. 8th Army, meanwhile, the Chinese PLA, People's Liberation Army flank attack. You can see that even engineers have to take up rifles fighting alongside bulldozers. That's a shot of them engaged right there, and push back the 8th Army as well. As the Americans fall back, as the 10th Corps falls back to Hungnam, it becomes what's known as, I call, the American Dunkirk. From the 12th to the 24th of December, 1950, they evacuate over 100,000 U.S., South Korean, and British personnel, as they're evacuating, over 100,000 North Korean refugees flood the town trying to get out as well. They don't want to live under the communists anymore. This man, Edward Almond, who's the overall ground commander of 10th Corps, has a decision to make. And this is something that I've used to talk about moral courage. His orders are silent on the question of what to do with these refugees. He legally could leave them on the beach, but he's not going to do that. All excess shipping space should be given to the refugees. They pack 14,000 into one merchant ship. They pack 5,000 into many of those LSTs. They evacuate 98,000 of them. They get them all out. 5 children are born at sea on the way to Pusan, and they get them out. The people of Korea remember this. They've made movies about this. And the fact that the United States did not abandon the Koreans is remembered and honored in the Republic of Korea today. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here a little bit later in the presentation. This is the end when they blow up the docks on Christmas Eve, 1950. But you can't excuse all this successful evacuation, everything cannot excuse the fact that nonetheless, there's been a significant defeat, and now back at essentially where they were October 1st. Now they've also got a new enemy. As MacArthur says, this is an entirely new war. There becomes a strategic debate now. What does this mean? Do we go nuclear against China? NATO looks at the situation and says, wait a minute, some of the NATO members have committed contingents to Korea to fight in Korea, to fight for South Korea. If we go to war with the Chinese, and we invade China, or we start bombing China, take the war beyond the Korean Peninsula, China has a mutual defense pact with the Soviet Union. So if you attack China, the Soviet Union is going to have to respond. And if the Soviet Union gets involved, where does the front line go? Berlin, middle of Europe. And all of a sudden, you have a third world war. And that's how it looks in London. That's how it looks in Paris. That's how it looks in a lot of places. Britain becomes a transatlantic liaison to make these points. Truman is of the opinion, as some of his staff and some of his chief of staff will later say, wrong war, wrong time, wrong place. We don't want to start World War III. They have a point. But Douglas MacArthur in Tokyo views it a little differently, and he says, this is the showdown with communism. If we don't solve this now, we'll be here in 2 generations. Guess what? We're still here in 2 generations. Truman and MacArthur are both right. But nonetheless, Truman decides it's time to start looking for a ceasefire and starts to put out some probes on that. Now we get into stabilization. And now as 1951 starts, not only is the political winds shifting, the battle lines are still shifting as well. And what goes on the battlefield will impact the outcome of these political debates. Walton Walker dies in a Jeep accident on the 23rd of December, 1950. Matthew Ridgway is brought literally from a Christmas party to take command of 8th Army in Korea. What he does with 8th Army is it could be a leadership talk in and of itself. It's one of the great, outstanding leadership jobs in the history of the United States Army. He's one of the great combat leaders, in my estimation, in the history of the United States Army. When he shows up in 8th Army, is on the 38th parallel in the lines you see solid here. The North Koreans attack on New Year's Eve, 1950, and the Chinese, I should say, the communists attack, and push in a series of offensives back down to where you see this dashed line known as line C right in here. Ridgway is able to stop the defense, stop them with a solid defense. And then the last kind of Chinese attack will begin at the Battle of Chipyong-ni in February of 1951. It's known as the Gettysburg of the Korean War because it's really kind of a turning point. And from this point, Ridgway will begin to launch a series of offensives back, known as Killer, Ripper, some other aggressive code names, and will gradually push north, retake Seoul, push north toward the 38th parallel. MacArthur and Truman continue the debate. MacArthur publicly appeals for a surrender of North Korea, scuttles what Truman was saying, basically publicly disputes what Truman is advocating. And when you publicly disagree with the president, Truman is forced to act. And so Truman relieves MacArthur, replaces him with Ridgway on the 11th of April, 1951. The communists launched one more counteroffensive in late April 1951, the Battle of the Inchon River, Gloucester Hill, one of the great battles in the British Army's history. Communists end up gaining some ground, but at losses of over 10+1. It exhausts them. And so it enables, over May and June, the 8th Army to move from this dotted line here, where they were in April, across the 38th parallel, most places, to where you see the solid line here, by June of 1951, where the advance is stopped. Why is the advance stopped? The long road to Armistice has now begun. Both sides have agreed to meet. They meet at Panmunjom, originally Kaesong of the ancient capital, later Panmunjom. The armistice begins between senior military leaders from the UN, senior military leaders from the North Koreans and the Chinese. Starts on the 10th of July, 1951. They immediately decide the mandate is to discuss a military ceasefire. Leave the politics to later. And they will occur in fits and starts until July of 1953. And both sides recessing, both sides playing games. Sometimes they will play the silent treatment to each other. It's a long and winding road that can be very infuriating with both sides. There are 5, as you can see, 5 negotiators from both sides. What are they here to do? First, what's the agenda? Which you would think would be an easy thing to figure out, but it's not. It takes several months just to figure out what the agenda should say. Once they figured that out, they need to set a military demarcation line and demilitarization zone, demilitarized zone, the DMZ, which is still there today. Then once they've settled that, they need to figure out the arrangements of the ceasefire, monitoring, verification, so nobody's taking advantage of each other, that sort of thing. Repatriation of prisoners of war. Both sides have captured significant numbers of prisoners of war. And then the last one is recommendations to the government of a permanent settlement. Remember, this is a military armistice only. Peace will come later. The key issue, really the key sticking point of all this, is the prisoners of war. UN POWs, you can see when most of them were captured, so many of them are brainwashed. Communist prisoners of war have been captured throughout the war. Some of them are communists that have intentionally have surrendered to organize in the camps and then try and organize uprisings, create problems. They will do that several times during the war. Other communist prisoners of war are, particularly in China, are former nationalists that have been captured by the communists at the end of the Chinese Civil War and have been sent as cannon fodder. And so many of them surrender at the first chance they get. And as far as they're concerned, they don't want to go back to the People's Republic of China. They want to go to Taiwan. And so that creates a problem because the Chinese and the communists, it's a tremendous blow to communist prestige of the Communist Party. If all these communist prisoners don't want to come home. And so they're more interested in having all these prisoners repatriated forcibly. And that's what we're talking about here, voluntary versus forced repatriation. The UN side, we want it to be voluntary, to screen everybody. Those that want to go home can go home. Those that might want to stay for whatever reason they feel is right can stay. And we've already talked about the nature of many Korean and Chinese prisoners of war who've been dragooned into the army, don't really have sympathy with the communist cause, and are trying to desert at the first opportunity and have deserted or surrendered to go south and stay south. The Ghosts of 1945. If you're familiar at all with, say, the movie GoldenEye, the James Bond movie, they talk about the Lienz Cossacks. There are some other cases where prisoners of war are repatriated forcibly into the former Soviet Union and are either executed by the Soviets, go into the Gulag, or worse. And the Allies are not interested in repeating that 5 years later, 5, 6, 7 years later. Ultimately, they will decide for voluntary repatriation. First, they swap wounded and sick, little switch in early 1953, and then the voluntary repatriation will be after the armistice known as Operation Big Switch. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment. But this is a key sticking point for both sides. One of the things that needs to be kept in mind is we're now in the early stages of the Cold War, and throughout the Cold War, the contest between communism and capitalism, between East and West, is as much about symbols as it is about actual gains and losses on the battlefield. And so the prisoners of war, what happens with the prisoners of war is a potent symbol to both sides. It would be a propaganda victory for the South and for the West, for the capitalist world, if most of these communists didn't want to go home. Whereas it's a propaganda defeat for the communists in the East, if most of these communists don't want to go home either. And so that's something that should be kept in mind. The fighting front during this period is relatively stable. It actually resembles World War I more than anything else. Very little movement. There is some movement. There are some battles. A de facto ceasefire. This lasts for a year, ending in late 1950. There are positional battles, Heartbreak Ridge, among others, as both sides are jockeying for tactical advantage as the negotiations go on. Air and naval operations, including bombardments by the USS Wisconsin, pound North Korea. In fact, the only battle damage USS Wisconsin ever sustains in her long and proud career was from a North Korean coastal gun in 1952. And if you visit the battleship in downtown Norfolk, you can see where that damage was and a plaque that talks about that story. Mark Clark takes over from Ridgway in 1952. March of 1953, Maxwell Taylor takes over 8th Army. And as the negotiations go on, the phrase comes current, we don't want to die for a tie. In other words, we want to survive the war. The war is going to end in a tie. We don't want to be the last one to die for a tie in that case. Ultimately, everything is worked out. And at 10 o'clock in the morning on the 27th of July, 1953, the armistice is signed. This is a photograph of it. Here are the communists here to the right, the US forces here to the left. They will take these and then countersigned by Clark and the commander to the north, Nam Il, countersigning as well, and then they will exchange. And that officially, within 12 hours after that, at 10 p.m. on the 27th of July, 1953, after 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days, the Korean War stops. And I use that word intentionally for reasons we are going to discuss here in a minute. This is the final position. This is the final battle line. This is the DMZ. The DMZ, the way they do it is they draw this front line literally down the middle of the DMZ, 2 kilometers on either side, 2 kilometers to the north 2 kilometers to the south. Both sides pull back, so there's a 4-kilometer buffer zone. And then safety and security of the northern part and patrolling the northern part is the responsibility of the communists, today the North Koreans. To the south of that is the responsibility of the UN forces, today primarily the South Koreans, although there are US forces that are involved there as well. People still die on the DMZ every year. This is still a hot spot, even with the moves toward peace in the last couple of years on the Korean Peninsula. This is still a very lethal place. It's the most heavily defended border in the world. And it hasn't moved since the 27th of July, 1953. And that's how you get the creation of the DMZ and the division, the permanent, so far, division of Korea. This is the prisoner of war swaps, as you can see, who was repatriated under in Operation Big Switch. The Chinese, those that don't go, end up going to Taiwan, where many of them are absorbed by Chiang Kai-shek's government. Many of the UN repatriates go home. A lot of them have post-traumatic stress. A lot of them will face issues. If you've seen the movie Manchurian Candidate, it's a pretty good, if impressionistic, depiction of some of those issues, particularly with the brainwashing. The most interesting thing, and this is worth pointing out because it's a lesson in communist values, is that many of those communist agents are, when they come back, the repatriates as well, they're all mistrusted. Even if they went and surrendered on communist orders to basically continue to fight the war as prisoners, they're all treated, because they had been out of communist control, because they had been exposed to the West, they are considered to be contaminated. And many of these Chinese agents will end up dying in the hands of the Mao regime in the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. And they're considered mistrusted. Many of them will spend time in the Gulag afterwards. The same fate had befallen many Soviet prisoners of war that had survived German captivity in World War II. Because they had been exposed to the West and were therefore considered tainted and potential traitors, they are mistrusted for the rest of their lives. And that's something that should be remembered in this discussion. It's worth pointing out. Now, as I mentioned, the war ends in an armistice. Peace remains elusive. Ceasefire was signed on the 27th of July, 1953. Called for a peace conference within 90 days. That didn't happen. Discussion was set for the 1954 Geneva Conference, the same one there where they decided to divide Vietnam and negotiate the exit of France from Indochina. They can't come to a resolution with Korea, and so they keep kicking the can down the road. And there's been limited progress on that since. And as I mentioned at the top, this war is still technically going on. We are still technically at war with North Korea. We don't have formal diplomatic relations with North Korea. We are still technically at war with North Korea. There are periodic flare-ups along the DMZ, as I talked about, periodic skirmishes. One of the things that North Korea has negotiated for in the past is, if you recognize our right to exist and give us a peace treaty, we will cut back on the nuclear armament program. The fact that has not been granted, well, you saw in the news the other day, that just a few days ago, that the North Koreans are starting missile tests again. So this is still a very, very touchy area. And it's still technically, as I mentioned, the war is still technically going on with all that means. When you think about the taking of USS Pueblo in 1968, you think about some of the incidents in the 1970s, even some of the incidents in the 80s and 90s, and some of the skirmishes that we've had. And even some of in 2010, when the North Korean and the South Korean Navy shot at each other and sank a South Korean corvette. This is still a highly, highly tense area. And it is a hot spot in the world. And it's one that's still with us and is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. I want to leave you with a couple more thoughts about relevance. And the two things I'll point out to you about this is, the first is the photograph here to the left, which is the Korean Peninsula at night from space. You can tell very clearly where South Korea is because it's lit up, it's prosperous. Today, it's one of the, in fact, they just had a presidential election today. It's a democratic nation. It's one of the most prosperous in the world. It's one of the largest economies in the world, one of the most wired nations in the world in terms of internet access and digital technology. Many of you, like me, probably have a Samsung phone or a Samsung television. Those are made in South Korea, among many other things. It's a tremendous. It's a leader. The country is a leader economically in the world. Contrast that with North Korea. This is Pyongyang, what I'm circling with my cursor, and you'll notice how most of the rest of it is dark. A literal darkness, as well as a metaphorical one. And that is something that they've had trouble since the mid-90s feeding their people, to say nothing of what COVID may have done, although they're not admitting anything publicly on that. That is the price. That photograph illustrates what MacArthur's point was. If we don't solve this now, we'll be here in 2 generations. And guess what? 2 generations and counting. The United States forces are still there. They're prepared to go fight tonight if they have to. The South Koreans are ready to be there too, and ready to defend their country. And the war is still technically going on. And you see the impact of those decisions to stop, and how the fates of millions, both North and South, were affected to varying degrees and varying destinations. The guy on the right is the current president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in. Moon Jae-in was elected in 2017. And when he came to the United States, he made a stop before he went to the White House on his first state visit. His stop was to Quantico, and he laid a wreath at the memorial to the Chosin Hungnam campaign. Now, why would he do that? 2 of those 98,000 refugees that were saved at Hungnam by General Alman's decision were his parents. In 1952, they had him, their eldest son. And he, in 2017, became the president of Korea. And he said when he was there, and it chokes me up every time, it does to this minute. He laid a wreath saying, "Thank you for saving my parents so that I could be born free." And he said, it's because of, and this is a quote, "because of the essential humanity of the United States military, I do not fear for the future of our alliance." This conflict occurred 70 years ago, right now, from 1950 to 1953. People may look at that and say, that's ancient history. Why does that matter? But when you consider the impact, the personal impact on world leaders, on a world leader of significance like this, and how it continues to influence and bind together the United States and South Korea. I do not fear for the future of our alliance, he said. And if he says that, I agree. And that's the impact of this war. From many standpoints, and certainly from this one, it puts a fine point on everything we've been talking about relevance here this evening. So as I conclude, I want to give you a few further readings. Some of you may be familiar with these books. I highly recommend many of them. The U.S. Army Official History is online. Several of these other books are outstanding as well. I recommend all of them. They are very good overviews and tell the story, capture the many facets of this great important conflict very, very well. And so with that, I will conclude my presentation. I'd like to thank you all for your attention. Thank you for spending time with me this evening to look at what is a very important and a highly relevant subject to this day, still has impacts today, and something that will be with us for a long time to come. And I really appreciate your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and Peggy, I'm going to turn it back over to you to see what kind of questions we have.
Chris, thank you so much. So many things are more clear to me now, but you really got me with that image of the Korean Peninsula from space. That says so much. It's very chilling.
Thank you. That they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. It sounds like a cliche, but when you see a photograph like that, it just it hits me right here too.
It says tons. It says tons. Wow. Well, I have one question, not related directly to your presentation, but can you tell us a little bit about your upcoming book while people are thinking of questions to ask?
Thank you for that. I'm glad you reminded me because I had completely forgot. I was so focused on Korea. My book is called Nations in the Balance, and it looks at the 1943-1944 India-Burma battles, Imphal, Kohima, Merrill's Marauders campaign, Joe Stilwell's campaign, and the Chindits and Ord-Wingate. And it looks at how those conflicts which are tremendous, underappreciated stories, human stories and human dramas in World War II. Not only decide who's going to win and lose on the Asian continent in World War II, but also influence Asian history over the intervening 75 years from 1944 to 2019 and beyond. And it's being done by Casemate. I'm really, really excited. It's actually coming out. It's coming out later this month, on or about the 23rd. And I am going to, if anybody's at all interested in more information, I'm going to put in the chat a link to about the book. And my publisher right now is actually doing 35% off the cover price if you pre-order before March 31st. And I've put the code in there if you want to use the special code to get 35% off the cover price. But there, I just put it in the chat for everybody. So feel free to have a look at it. If you're so inclined, I would appreciate it if you made a pre-order, and then they'll get it out to you here in the next few weeks. But again, it's coming out on or about March 23rd. I'm really excited. They're really excited, and it's an important story. I'm glad to be shedding some light on.
It's 2 weeks away, and maybe you'll come back and do a presentation on that.
Love to, Peggy.
I know I'm getting my order in. And we will put that link on our website when we announce the availability of your YouTube, you on YouTube. So I'm not seeing any questions. I think you must have been so thorough.
Well, that's okay. It's a complicated subject. We had to cover a lot of ground tonight. And
it was so clear and so well organized. It was beautifully organized, and all of those civilians who were rescued, absolutely amazing. And just so many parallels to what's going on today all over the world. It was great. Food for thought.
Yeah, when we booked this, I wasn't necessarily expecting, shall we say, some parallel events to the invasion of June 1950, this time in Ukraine.
Yeah. And they say history tends to repeat itself, right?
You got it. You got it.
So we thank you. We hope we will see you again to talk about the Burma India campaign. And y'all, I will put the information on our website about how you can order Chris's book for 30% off.
35, actually.
35% off, even better.
Yep.
Thank you so much. And we hope to see you all back in April 13th for our next program. And thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Peggy. Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody. Good night. Thank you.